Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we're going to be talking about electric vehicles and the environmental impact of them and the environment as a whole. And to help us do that, we've got two wonderful guests. Jennifer Hernandez is joining us for the second time on the podcast. Jennifer is a partner in the law firm Holland and Knight, and she is their West Coast land use and environmental group head. She splits her time between San Francisco and Los Angeles and has a tremendous amount of experience in the environmental debate here in California. And also is Ron Stein. Ron is trained as an engineer. He's internationally published columnist and energy consultant, and especially focusing in on the issue of the use of petrochemicals, the use of oil, and its role in society. Ron and Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be aboard.
Very nice. Thank you.
Well, so I thought the big irony, Joel, this was kind of a fun thing. During the big heat up that we had a couple of weeks ago, the state came out with the pronouncement that, we're going to have rolling blackouts and with flex alert. And so please don't charge your electric vehicle during the peak energy use period. I just thought the irony of that was just tremendous. I wonder what that says to both you, Jennifer, and you, Ron, about the state of electric vehicles.
You want me to go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the auto industry has been mandated into a death spiral. There's many things. We'll talk about electricity first. The grid, everybody's concerned about the stability of the grid. And yeah, you're right. We have the heat spell, don't charge your EV. California is the only state that, well, we import more electricity than any other state from our neighboring states. And we continue to shut down power plants. Newsom gave the Diablo Canyon a life extension because he needed the votes. But after a couple of years, it's going to go down. And wind and solar aren't going to do it. And the UK is really setting the tone for California. Because in the UK, if you have an EV, your charger at home is programmed not to work 9 hours a day during peak load requirements to help the grid. And most importantly, your charger is on a separate meter because they know they got to rebuild the grid. And you know who's going to pay for it? The EV users. So it's rates are going to be going sky high for electricity for the EV users.
I was just wondering, Jennifer, from what your work is, what have been the ancillary effects of the high energy prices and the EV policies? I mean, it seemed to me, Assemblyman Cooper has made the point that he said, people in minority communities and working class communities, no way they're ever going to afford a EV in the foreseeable future. What do you think the impacts are going to be on different groups if we go ahead with the current plan to essentially phase out gas-powered cars?
Well, I think one thing we'll see is the continuation of, I'll call it the Havana syndrome, California style, where those old cars, no matter how inefficient or polluting, and the simplest ones will be the ones to survive, will survive in a market that desperately continues to need to use vehicles. So we're going to take a step backward in terms of improving air quality because the old fleet will continue instead of being replaced. Just how bad is it? California sets a standard of $4,600 or so for the value of a car. And if you own a car that's worth more than that, you are disqualified from receiving food stamps or other public assistance. There is no EV vehicle in the United States that is worth less than that if it still operates. Of course, if it doesn't operate and it's a giant paperweight, okay, but it's simply not a vehicular option. Also, we have a housing crisis, and about 40% of Californians live at or near the poverty line when all costs are taken into account, as documented by United Way of California. EVs take electricity. Electricity prices have been rising 5 times higher than the rest of the country for several years in California. The idea that EVs are going to be cheaper as electricity prices continue to climb is nonsense. But with the housing crisis and with tools to eliminate parking, for example, as a mandatory component of housing, we just don't have the EV charging capabilities in most communities. So are you going to take this car and leave it parked where? At a school 5 blocks away or 18 blocks away overnight so it charges? And by the way, if you're charging it overnight, you're almost guaranteed to be charging it with natural gas. The sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow. So you're using that backup supply of actual reliable electricity. And that's going to be gas or a little bit of hydro, not so much batteries yet. So in this world where, we're fighting, among other things, a pretty significant crime problem and theft problem, we're asking people to take their EV and not park it where they live, but park it somewhere and hope for the best overnight when it's not even going to be charged from renewable sources. And if they park it during the day, well, guess what? People have to drop it during the day. That's the last point is, the way people who were taken off welfare during the Gingrich and Clinton welfare reforms, the people that stayed off welfare had access to a private car. And if they did, they could keep the kids in school, they could get to work on time, they could get to better food and medical care, and they did okay. You take away that private car, and the success rates of families in transition out of poverty drop precipitously. This is an unbelievably cruel and regressive tool that undoes civil rights laws that gave undocumented immigrants driver's licenses because it's so critical to be able to legally drive. And of course, California's approach is not Britain's. We're not going to make the people who own EVs, God forbid, pay more. We're going to subsidize them with subsidies for very high cost EVs and for electric batteries and solar. And we're going to charge more to the people who don't have batteries or solar on their homes, which means people are getting hit double at the working and lower income.
Well, and this is beyond the social issues that you're talking about, which are just, frankly, I had not really thought about that. I had not thought about the access issues that people would have or non-access to cars and what the social impact would be on the middle class. This also affects the entire supply chain for almost everything, right, Ron? Because of the ubiquitous nature of petroleum.
Yeah, let me address the subsidy issue first, because after co-authoring the book Clean Energy Exploitations, it was nominated for Pulitzer Prize because we were trying to bring transparency to the fact that all these exotic minerals and metals that are building the batteries and wind turbines and solar panels is, the lithium and the cobalt, it's coming from developing countries that have yellow skin, brown skin, black skin people. These countries have no environmental controls, no labor controls. They're being exploited to help the wealthy countries, get their batteries, and providing subsidies to buy an EV is basically a financial incentive to continue this environmental degradation and humanity atrocities occurring. I personally, I qualified for an EV, highly educated, high income, low mileage requirements, multi-car family. But I had made a personal decision, I will not buy an EV. And I will not buy an EV for ethical reasons, because I'm not willing to financially support what's going on in China and Africa to get these materials to clean America. So yeah, the supply chain of those materials it's under control of the Chinese. And the one thing the press has not yet picked up on is the supply chain of all materials. There are 700 refineries in the entire world, and they're all old. They're all built, 50 or more years ago, and getting expensive to maintain. The locals don't want them. And consequently, they're forecasting in the next 5 years, 20% are going to shut down. Now we're talking about 140 refineries shutting down. That's basically the supply chain, because crude oil is useless unless you can manufacture it into something usable. when it goes to the refinery, it makes all these oil derivatives. It makes 6,000 products as part of our daily lives, because everything that needs electricity is made with products made with the oil derivatives. And so the supply is going to be reduced by 20%. Well, demand internationally for products, iPads and phones and TVs and medical supplies, it's increasing. That's a great formula for shortages and inflation in perpetuity. And not only is the price of lithium going to go skyrocketing, the price of all materials is going to go skyrocketing. And you thought the EVs were expensive now? Wait, they're going to get more expensive, as well as all cars. So it's going to be a tough road to hoe. And
yeah, I was just wondering, and maybe Jennifer, and then I'd like to get your views, Ron. Given that this is something that is what, 5% of the drivers, 10% of the drivers, and they want to basically ratchet up very quickly, how did that happen politically? I mean, I gotta believe that the person who represents East LA or South LA or Oakland, why are people who represent those districts supporting a policy that's obviously terrible for them? I'm trying to have our viewers understand, how does something like this happen?
Well, it's a good question, Joel, because the fact is this EV mandate was rejected by the legislature several years in a row. It's been proposed, there have been hearings, there have been testimony, and the answer is no, not going to be able to support this. The leadership has often allowed a mechanism that prevents people from having to vote against it. It just kind of dies on the vine rather than be defeated, but they've been defeated each and every session. What happened to this bill, and I don't know whether I'm partly to blame because I wrote a pretty strong letter to CARB, the Air Resources Board, which adopted a regulation mandating an EV transition without legislative authority. And I say you couldn't do this in August. Well, 2 weeks later, the governor decided to cram down his climate pact as part of what is, I think, very much transparently a run for governor. He wants to be the climate leader of the country. It's very flashy, it's very sexy. There's lots of tech companies that would very much like to be in that space. We've had, about a decade of ESG lobbying of big, not just big oil, but big investors and big auto, saying, we just have to stop using fossil fuel, and anybody who uses fossil fuel is evil. So the automakers more or less came to agreement that they could do this. They're going to have to sell a lot of new cars, not exactly painful for them, but I don't know how they're going to do it, honestly, with the price points we have. And the governor crammed it down 2 weeks. And the governor has lots of levers. He could veto bills by authors who desperately wanted those bills. He could steer dollars one way or another to different districts and different projects. The chief executive was elected by the people, and he chose to cash in some of that capital to become the nation's climate badge holder, merit badge holder.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about legislative influence, and I'd like to hear this from Ron too, you talked about the auto manufacturers basically saying, okay, we can deal with it. Where are the petroleum manufacturers, the Exxon Mobils and the Shells in this? Are they kind of behind the scenes trying to undercut this, or are they also saying, okay, we've got bets in all places, so we'll go for it?
Well, let me address a couple things first. Joel talked about, how do the little people get their voice into it? And Jennifer's 100% correct. It's being mandated. Newsom wants it, Biden wants it, and it's just kind of rolling down through society. And the problem is, when they speak, everybody listens. And as an engineer, I thought the hybrid was the greatest thing around, because you instantly double your mileage. It gives us another 50 years to develop battery technology. But in retrospect, the auto industry has been mandated not to make hybrids. You're going to find very few of them because they have to, whatever they're manufacturing, the emissions have to be lower and lower and lower. Well, the only way to meet those numbers is they have to eliminate the hybrid because that's got a gasoline engine. And so in 2035, it's going to be 100% EVs by almost all the manufacturers. Another problem is that, in the United States, we manufactured, I think, 11 million vehicles in 2019. But when you take a look at China, Japan, India, Germany, South Korea, they manufactured 50 million, 5 times more than us. So most of the EVs are going to be coming from overseas. That becomes a problem. How do you get them from there to here? Because if you recall, in early March, a cargo ship, the Felicity Ace, 650-foot ship, caught fire and sank. It had 4,000 cars on it. And inexpensive cars. They're Bentleys, Lamborghinis, Maseratis, 4,000 cars. It burned for days. The crew members got off safe, but the cause or the contributor was an EV battery fire. When EVs ignite, they're a chemical fire. You can't put them out. All you can do is cool it. And this ship burned for days, and like I said, crew members got off safe, and it sank. Well, now consider yourself Lloyd's of London. You're not going to be too excited about insuring the next cargo ship with EVs. In fact, Germany is recommending in many of the cities, don't park your EV in an underground structure because they can't get to it.
Well, Jennifer, you're an EV driver. Were you at all?
Yeah, no, I did the first.
Garages?
Yeah, I did the first Prius. I did the second Prius. I tried the Honda hybrid. Those Priuses were both hybrids. And then the rules changed, so only all electric vehicles got to jump the line at the Bay Bridge, which was my motivator. And I had a son who was in the middle of his auto euphoria that you guys go through. And so he talked me into buying a Tesla. So there I was. It's a super fun car to drive. I'm not going to kid you. It rides like a Bentley. It has pickup like nobody's business. But I'm wealthy enough to own a Tesla. And yet, when we go on a road trip to Yosemite, which we like to do, it's not the Tesla we're driving. When I come down and stay in our apartment here in Marina Del Rey, it's not the Tesla. It's an old Outback. I mean, there's a reliability issue here. And that's for us. I don't know about, again, most people who are mandating this stuff, but in my household, cars stretched. I mean, there was the morning drop off and the kids, and then the next drop off of the worker, and then the mom kept the car and she did errands, and then she picked up everybody. And then there was often an evening teenager who wanted to use the darn car. There wasn't a lot of downtime on the car. Now, of course, we've got the tragedy of people even living in cars, which is horrible. But the idea that everybody has a secure place to park a car for 8 hours and take juice off the grid is just nonsensical. We already can't accommodate the cars that we have in San Francisco with even street parking, let alone an EV-only fleet.
Yeah, Jennifer is 100% correct because she fits the profile. She and I, highly educated, high income, multi-car family, and low mileage requirements for the EV. And the EV for Californians, since half the EVs in the entire country are here in California, statistically, they're only being driven like 5,000 miles a year. They're a toy. And most people, or most families are not, multi-car families. They need a workhorse. And it's going to be tough. So our biggest concern I have for the auto industry is where are the buyers? You got the elites. Now, California, we got the most temperate climate. That's probably why we have half the EVs in the country. But in cold climate, in hot climates, you don't see any EVs. If the other half of the EVs are distributed through the other 49 states, that's an easy calculation. It's kind of like 1% per state. You don't see them in other states.
What happens if we get to 2035 and California, it seems to me the one or two directions, if the Democrats get control of the Congress, the whole country becomes California, and then it's a very different game. If we don't have that happen and it's more divided, the question I have is, and maybe Jennifer, the legal situation. I want to buy a hybrid. Do I have to go and drive to Yuma to buy it? And then am I does that, but I can't register it in California, is that?
There's a very open-ended Commerce Clause question as to what happens with cars that are purchased in another state. Just like there's an open-ended question about trucks purchased in another state or even country, and how much California can regulate them. California's been very creative and generally successful. You know, you can own a truck from Mexico or from another state that doesn't have all the right emission control equipment, but you're not going to be able to access the ports of Long Beach and LA. So they can regulate at the local level to impose standards. That's one of, you know, a dozen or so workarounds, each of which has its own, I think, you know, vulnerability. But will the courts enforce is a pretty big question. You know, I guess
last week there was the talk about banning diesel big rigs completely from California. And I was wondering, you know, how that fits in. Are there even EV big rigs that one could purchase and even use?
So I'll start on that, Ron, and then you pick it up. This is a really big fight right now between the South Coast Air Quality Management District, which has access to low NOx vehicles that do work and are available, and they're 90% cleaner. So if you're worried about localized air pollution in frontline communities, you want the low NOx or ultra low NOx vehicle. You don't want to wait for what doesn't exist. To your point, Marshall, these trucks don't exist. And what we're now seeing, at least in some of the climate debates I'm involved in, is the rise of the engineer. You know, we've had the climate scientists, we've had the political scientists, we've had the sociologists. We don't really talk to material scientists because that's scary and chemical. But now we're talking to at least some engineers who are like, are you kidding? We can't do this. What are you kidding? We have a grid that doesn't support the current load. And by the way, it's not just whether you can move your car. I think both the truck example and the EV example are frankly deflections. The real agenda is to just not have nearly as many cars and not have nearly as much logistics activity at the port. It's a reduction in that kind of industrialized trading activity. And okay, fine, if that's where you want to take society, go for it, I guess. But then let's debate that, because 40% of the Southern California economy depends on ports. And your bus solution, even CARB agrees, twice as long to get to work by bus, where buses exist, which is almost nowhere. Less than 3% of Californians can go by bus to almost anywhere they need to go. So, you know, there isn't a solution, and then solutions like remote work are not sufficiently politically correct. So it's a spin of advocates, NGOs, and lawyers, and they try not to talk to Ron or any engineer.
Well, from an engineer's point of view, most of the trucks are actually owned by individuals, and they can't afford to buy new trucks. And I think they're going to take the same position as Mike Gardner is. You know, they're going to basically ban gas-powered blowers. And Mike Gardner, he really doesn't care, because when he buys a new blower, it'll last like 10 years. So he's going to buy a blower in 2034. It'll last 10 years. And by the time it conks out, he'll have retired. So he's not even concerned about it. And I think you can see the same thing about the truckers. They're not going to be here when the, you know, with proverbial, you know, something hits the fan. And yeah, it's like I say, it's a time bomb. And when 2035 comes and, you know, it's not happening, you know, what's your recourse?
Well, what we're finding when we're talking to business people in particular is they think that we're already beginning to see this port business, which, by the way, is the largest source of high-wage blue-collar jobs in California, you know, whether it's Oakland or the Bay Area. And by the way, I spoke with a colleague in Seattle, same things happening up there. So doesn't that mean eventually that these jobs are all going to go to Houston and Tampa and
As they reroute
Savannah
to other more permissive areas?
Well, I think that the theory, Joel, is that there'll be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 massive trucking companies replacing the fleet of independent operators that Ron mentioned. They will have EV vehicles of whatever nature and can finance them through normal high-end corporate deals, which makes a lot of people money. And then drivers will be employees, union employees, and work for those few companies, and they won't have their own truck anymore. That model is being eliminated. Now, there are scaling challenges with that approach, which will, of course, send a lot of cargo to other states. But so what?
Well, let me ask you this. What's the alternative? Let's say you agree with the notion that we need to clean air up. Kind of hard to disagree with that. What should we have done? What direction should we have taken it in rather than this? And is there still time to kind of steer things, excuse the pun, in a different direction?
I have a lot of faith in humanity's ingenuity. And, when we invented the automobile and the airplane, the early automobiles, they were smokers. The early refineries, they were smokers. The steel mills were smoking away. But technology, we learned to control them. And today, I think, well, when I talk refineries, California's got the cleanest refineries in the world. And I think we got, the cleanest vehicles. And I think the technology keeps improving, the mileage efficiency keeps improving. And, the problem is, Marcia, you really can't get rid of oil because everything's made with oil. You want to go to a decarbonized society? We had a decarbonized society in the 1800s. So there were no coal-fired power plants. There were no natural gas power plants. The Beverly Hillbillies hadn't discovered oil yet. And so, but life was short. It was hard when you were born. You very seldom traveled 100 miles from where you lived. We had none of the products we have. We had no medications. We had no electronics, no communication systems. We had no jets, no ships, no planes. And, that was a decarbonized society. And you really can't go back there. I'd love to get rid of crude oil, but there's no proven substitute. You don't want to jump out of an airplane without a parachute.
It sounds to me like what you're saying is that the mitigation technologies are getting better. So that rather than throwing out the entire fundamental chemistry system, and we have the ability to actually continue to make progress toward cleaner air, cleaner water, toward mitigating pollution. And that why would we actually want to walk away from that?
Well, also think about, it's only the wealthy countries that are pursuing all these green movements. Take the United States, the UK, Australia, Germany. You take those four countries, you're representing about 6% of the world. The other 94% is doing their thing, because you could take those four countries, wipe them off the face of the earth. Every person, manufacturer, anything that emits anything, get rid of it. And the result is emissions are going to explode. China and India, they got thousands of coal-fired power plants in Africa. They're building them almost like one a day. And they don't have enough of an economy to subsidize themselves out of a paper bag. So, we're living in a bubble. And like I say, 6% of the world is not going to change the world. So we can clean up our bubble, but it's going to be very expensive. And as Jennifer mentioned, if you get the truckers to be unionized, boy, then their rates are going up. Cost of delivering that banana has gone up, and the groceries go up. So inflation and shortages in perpetuity. That's the thing we're being faced with this green agenda we have, and it's all for naught because China, India, and Africa, they control the emissions of the world.
Yeah, I have, I think, a little bit different view, and maybe it's because of the practice I have, but we certainly didn't know in 1972 how to clean up tailpipe emissions. People had some ideas, but we didn't know. Who knew you could take, rare earth minerals, whatever those are, and put them into a gizmo called a catalytic converter and take lead out of gas and end up with tailpipe emissions that the Obama administration reported were 99% cleaner for smog forming pollutants. That was a hell of an achievement, but we didn't know it. And we didn't say everybody has to give up their car or, make it so expensive that that's the practical effect. We very methodically, it took a little while, worked it. Now, on the took a little while point, if you believe that this is a climate emergency, think about gearing up and manufacturing all of the component parts needed for not just an EV car, but a brand new grid and all kinds of additional electric generation capacity. Think about the massive investment in materials needed to even come close to that vision. And how realistic is it to think that that's going to happen in the next 10 years? We've never done anything like that ever, even when we didn't have NEPA or CEQA or anything else. Also, we keep thinking that the only solution is a different version of the same technology. Remote work is a different solution. Broadband technology and the internet are a different solution. Zoom is a different solution. We're not together. None of us have driven long distances to be together today, where we would have done that, not too many years ago. So I really just think this is a hugely disrespectful undermining of core principles like upward mobility and equality. If you don't mind forcing those least able to live worse, to spend twice as long to get on a bus to be late to work, to spend 3 times as much on fuel or food, if you don't mind doing that, if that's your moral compass, God help you, but put it to the people for a vote. Don't keep sneaking around saying EVs and wear little merit badges.
Well, here's something. Jennifer, you're a lawyer. Ron, you're an engineer. But somehow, I think what we really need to understand this is a good psychiatrist. There is something seriously wrong when I'll give you this just to think about. Young man, engineer, PhD student at Stanford calls me up and he says, "Look, I want to talk to you about the EVs." He says, "Well, I'm doing all this research, but every time I ask the question, where's the power coming from? They say, don't think about it." And he said, "I'm an engineer. I'm supposed to realize if I do A, the effect is B." So is there something going on here that's almost like almost psychotic that we're
let me take that because I'm from Berkeley, right? So I remember
the center of psychosis.
I remember people with that weird glaze in their eyes, who are followers of whatever. And
I went to Berkeley too, so.
When our son was 4, we were dutifully touring various schools for him to start kindergarten, right? And for various reasons, I don't even want to go into it. You can't imagine the variety of Berkeley schools. So we were at this nice little school that focused on music. And it was British headmaster. And he talked about how they do experiential learning with the kids. And, how do you form a town? Well, you've got a river with fish and you've got a forest with trees. And soon there's a trading system. And then you want to have nice stuff. So there's a merchant class. And he sort of described in a very simple way the emergence of civilization as we know it. So these 3 ladies rush the poor man after the presentation and shout, "How can you rape Mother Gaia?" Now, when you start there, there's not a common ground, right? There's just what do you do with that? You leave Berkeley, but we didn't. We stayed. It was great. But we didn't go to that school.
But there is that sense within the environmental movement of this hyper alarmist mentality that
and religious
says we are on the verge of humanity's destruction, and so we have to, and that's not disputable, right? It in fact may in reality be disputable, but from most people's perspective, that you touch a wire there, and you're not allowed to say that it's not the case. So I don't know how we break through the carapace here of kind of bias toward environmental alarmism.
Well, let me give you a perspective. I think the biggest confusion among Biden and Newsom and all the people who want to go green is they talk about renewable energy is going to replace fossil fuels. Impossible. because renewable energy, i.e. wind and solar, only generate electricity. They can manufacture nothing for society. And Biden and Newsom, they're oblivious to the reality that everything that needs electricity is made from the oil derivatives manufactured from crude oil. In an all-electric world, just wind and solar electricity from breeze and sunshine, there'd be nothing to power. And if you take a look at it, all the parts for wind turbines, all the parts for solar panels, all the parts for vehicles, EVs and regular vehicles, are made with the oil derivatives. So you get rid of oil, you get rid of everything. You get rid of wind turbines, solar panels. The best thing about getting rid of oil, you ground Air Force One.
Well, one more point is, and this I'm going to attribute to my esteemed colleague David. He was mentioning is, if you were thinking about normal environmental policy, you would say, how would you get to a transition to a cleaner, maybe not supreme clean, but much cleaner from a greenhouse gas perspective economy? And you would not, in the ordinary course of environmental law, say, first, we have to cover 5 states with solar panels, which is in fact what the advisors to the Biden administration who informed that new law said is going to be needed. You would not redo the entire transmission system in the country and then put some additional bells and whistles on it. You wouldn't have Condor Cuisinarts running blades over bird habitat. You would probably say, well, look, we got these old behemoth now, gas-fired stuff. What can we stick there? What can we stick inside that footprint? The transmission lines there, I know, how about those things that never seem to blow up, notwithstanding movies, that we've powered our nuclear naval fleet for successfully for what now, 60 years? How about if we put some nukes on our gas-fired power plants? Now we got the transmission capacity. Now we don't have nearly the consumption of water or anything else. And, why not? Oh, no, that's scary. Well, that's more scary than paving 5 states?
Well, to your earlier point, when we solved the catalytic converter and emissions problem by focusing research on it and creating new technologies that actually address the problem. This can happen across the board. It's happening in nuclear. In fact, there's whole new generations of nuclear technology that are significantly less emitting in the radioactive area and less expensive to run, but they're not being considered. So I don't know. This is a very disturbing trend, because the minute you open up the discussion to alternatives that are not blessed, it seems to me that the debate just stops.
California is worse than the feds, and our advocates are much more, I think, intent on doing evil. If you accept evil as doing intentional harm to people who can't defend themselves. But even they agree that it's going to be net zero, which means we're going to be sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, but only for some things and only for a little bit. Well, if we can suck enough carbon out of the atmosphere, why don't we make it possible for people to get to work?
Ron, any final thoughts from you about how you would address this problem?
Well, Jennifer's right about us going over the cliff here, because today we got there's 50,000 jets in the world, and there's 50,000 merchant ships, and the world populated from 1 to 8 billion in less than 200 years. Now we need those jets and merchant ships to move products around the world to keep people, fed and healthy and alive and everything. And so it's, I'm not sure where you're going to go from there. And it's going to be a rough road to hoe. I mentioned one example about the evilness of the AQMD. The Bay Area AQMD wants to have 2 of the Northern California refineries get cleaner. As I mentioned, the refineries in California are the cleanest in the world, but they want 2 to get cleaner. So they want Chevron and PBF to reduce their particulate emissions, because they calculate 12 people are going to have asthma attacks, and they want to stop that. Well, to do that, each refiner would have to spend in excess of $1 billion. And both refiners have said, if this holds up in court, we're out of here. We're shutting down. Well, when you take a look at it, Chevron and PBF are the only two Northern California refineries that manufacture aviation fuel for the international airports at San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, Sacramento, and the entire military in Northern California. So when those two refineries go down, the aviation fuel comes from China. Now, the AQMD doesn't care if 1,000 people die from air pollution over there. They're going to save 12 here. So it's, like I say, it's
Not just ask the Europeans how that worked for them.
That's right. It's going to be a tough winter for them, this relying on breezes and sunshine.
Well, I'd just like to close with this one thought. Even though the name of our podcast is the Feudal Future Podcast, we really, truly do not advocate moving the country back to the 1400s. I just want to let you know that.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I just have one last thought, just to tie up with feudalism, is this is really the road to feudalism. I mean, this is really, this is very much like the Middle Ages, a very limited amount of access to wealth for the vast majority of people. And we have this kind of psychotic religion that's also happening, which was very much like it's like the fossil fuels are the devil's spawn and we have to, wipe it out. And so I think in a lot of ways, the road to feudalism in part will be powered by this transition that we're talking about.
Yeah. And I just want to say thank you again to Ron and Jennifer for helping us out. If we had a theme music today, it would be the Beverly Hillbillies theme song. Black Gold, Texas Tea. Thank you so much for giving our viewers a sense of what's really going on here with this entire EV debate and the broader debate about energy. So thanks a million, and we look forward to seeing you again on another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast.
Thank you.
Have a great day.